get in, but I think we should make a start. So a very warm welcome, first of all, from myself, the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which some of you may already be aware of. It's a project that took the form of a year-long nationwide real-life face-to-face festival from March 2019 to March 2020, whose primary remit was to celebrate the profound and wide-ranging, diverse, rich contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. And you can see immediately how Ruth Borchard fits the bill perfectly there. On this particular occasion, we're partnering with Jewish Renaissance magazine, which again, some of you may know about, in organizing a whole series of internment-related online events. To somewhat belatedly, it's true, but just about catching the 80th anniversary of that very morally murky and indeed complicated internment episode of 1940 to 41. Now, just a few practical details, I think probably goes without saying. Please stay muted if you wouldn't mind for the moment. We are recording the event, so I will say more about that later. Questions, and I imagine I already know that some of you have direct personal connections to the whole internment story. Please, in the first instance, type your questions into the chat function, and I'll sort of sift through them and moderate them later. Now, I imagine that all of you have had a chance, I hope you have had a chance to watch that rather wonderful film, short but pithy film by Richard Shaw, who I think might in fact be in the audience today. He hasn't actually revealed himself yet, and maybe that he'd like to say a few words towards the end. And we'll have your own questions and sort of comments in the wake of watching it. But what I'd like to do, and in fact what I'm going to do now just quickly, is to make sure that you see the main protagonist, as it were, Philip Van. Just give me a moment. That's Spotlight. Right, and where's David gone? David's here. There we go, and then I guess myself as well. Good, so hopefully you can see us writ large on the screen, whether you want to or not. Anyway, so what I'd like to do is a kind of a sequel or follow on from the screening that you will, I hope, very much have enjoyed, to pick up on some of the things that can't be treated in such a short film. Focusing first of all, I'm looking now particularly at Philip Van, on a sort of wider sense of Ruth's background, her arrival in this country, and indeed her activities not only as a very important collector of a tremendous selection of self-portraits by British-based artists, and what has happened since then. That's something that perhaps we can touch on later. But also, Philip, she was an interesting woman in her own right, wasn't she? And I wonder if I could indeed start the ball rolling. Philip, by the way, I should have said, is a well-known, well-established, and indeed a prolific author of monographs and other publications on different aspects of 20th century art. He's the author of a wonderful book published in 2004 called Face to Face, let me get the subtitle correct, British Self-Portraits in the 20th Century, which is essentially a chance to celebrate Ruth Borchard's collection. And I should mention before we forget that he has written a revised version, which is hopefully going to see the light of day, perhaps with Thames and Hudson, we don't yet know, but it's looking promising, next year. And Philip, one thing I'd be very interested to hear from you is, how you have supplemented that original text, what you have learnt in the meantime since 2004, particularly in relation to Ruth herself. So tell us more about the woman herself.
Yes, Ruth was born in 1910 in a fishing village near Hamburg. Her father was a businessman, and then she went on to enjoy a kind of academic career in a sense. She studied at the University of Hamburg. There was an exchange student studying economics and social psychology for a PhD at the University of Wisconsin. In 1937, she married Kurt Borchard, who ran the Borchard family shipping business in Hamburg and later in London. The following year, the couple, along with Kurt's mother Lucy, came to England as refugees from Nazism, and Ruth's mother and father followed them in 1939. And then the war years came in this country, and they were both a liberating and traumatic experience for her, because she was she was sent to Holloway Prison for a while, and then both she and Kurt were separately interned on the Isle of Man. And while she was she did write some letters to her husband in 1940 about her experience in Holloway Prison. And she wrote that the experience wasn't entirely negative. She wrote that I have not enjoyed clouds as much as I do here, except in the Alps. These were the clouds she could see through her cell window. And she expressed her surprise at the incredible shift in standards and values resulting from these drastically altered circumstances. And she wrote, "Strange things are utter luxuries, scouring sand, soap flakes, ink, envelopes, and the books on which to hang your clothes are a favourite object for pinching here. I am much envied for my clothes hanger. On the whole, it is marvellous with how few things one can get along perfectly well." And then later, living in a large house in Reigate with her husband and children, she one day had the idea of creating this collection of self-portraits. She had considered collecting first editions and diaries, and then one day she wrote, "In literature, my taste ran to introspective books, diaries, autobiographies, letters. Over the years, I often felt tempted to collect first editions of these moderns. Then one day, mounting up the stairs in our house in Reigate, I was struck by the idea that introspection in painting meant self-portraits. I vividly remember the moment, even the step, where I suddenly saw our landing crowded with paintings, all sizes, types, styles, media. And this is exactly what has come to pass." So that was the genesis of the collection.
What about her activities as a writer? Because she wrote a very wide and slightly, to me, sort of intriguing,
Yes,
sort of spectrum of different kind of books. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that as well.
yes. On one of the book jackets of one of her novels, she included these biographical details, which are quite intriguing. She said, "Besides writing, her interests are dowsing with a pendulum, collecting of roses, and self-portraits by living English artists, and centrally religion." And I think religion was very important to her. She had a kind of mystical understanding of things, and that comes across in her correspondence, especially with the painter and self-portraitist Ethel Colquhoun. And she wrote, a writer who she'd met in Israel wrote of her latest book, "Oh, My Own Rose, The History and Symbolism of the Rose." If it was anything like its author, it was sure to be scholarly, provocative, speculative, optimistic, not to mention full of things to argue about in the pleasantest possible way. And I think that gives a good sense of what Ruth was like as a person.
She also, I think, wrote, am I correct? She wrote a biography of John Stuart Mill, again, totally different books on, as you say, Jewish mysticism, also a children's book. And I was particularly intrigued, and I'd be interested to know if anybody in the audience can throw more light on this. She published, I think, in the early 60s, a book called The Children of the Old House, with illustrations by Milan Kosman, who I had the pleasure of knowing personally. She lived near me in Hampstead, a wonderful draftswoman, absolutely consummately skilled draftswoman. I wonder whether, Philip, you'd come across any evidence of the friendship or the relationship between the two of them?
I haven't come across any particular evidence of that, but I think it must relate possibly to her very free and happy childhood in a village with her siblings by a river near Hamburg. And there was a wonderful sense of freedom and free roaming that the children enjoyed. I can't tell you any more than that.
No, it's something I'd like to try and find out more about. And I don't think we have this Ines Schlenker, who's a friend and colleague of mine, who's written a monograph on Milan, but I have a feeling she doesn't know that much more about it. Milan was, again, of German Jewish background, came as a young refugee to this country. And that sort of makes me also wonder, Philip, about the wider perhaps predominantly emigre circles in which Ruth and her husband mixed. Do you know much about that?
She mixed with a great range of people. I mean, in Reigate, she had a kind of a salon, really. And Michael Knox, who did that wonderful portrait of Ruth, and he and his wife were frequent visitors, and they found it a very stimulating event, you know, a regular event, and all kinds of subjects, political, cultural, philosophical, were discussed over supper. But Ruth did approach many artists from very diverse backgrounds. And of course, they did include emigre artists. I mean, there were the great Polish artists, Felix Topolsky and Henryk Gottlieb, and several others. And then there were artists from other backgrounds, such as, let me just find a note. Also, amongst the Polish artists, they were people who settled in Britain either before the First World War, Second World War, or during the war. Marek Zulawski was another of these painters who lived in St. John, in a lovely studio, eventually in St. John's Wood. And Andrzej Kuhn was one of the painters who she commissioned to do a self-portrait. And he had spent much of the war as a child in Russian labor camps. And Hans Schwartz, who was born in Vienna, but as a Jew came as a refugee in England. And he wrote that in 1940, I was interned as an enemy alien. And he said, very poignantly, I think, you couldn't have had less of an enemy than the lot of us.
Well, that sort of sums it up, doesn't it? Yvonne, is Hans Schwartz somebody you, or indeed David, you've come across in your work? Is that a name that's familiar to you?
Well, I mean, I suppose I would add in the interest, and not only interest, the training she had as an economist, because we'll touch on that, I'm sure, in talking later about the service exchange. But I mean, it's interesting that she did actually, after leaving the Isle of Man, she subsequently worked with Professor Hayek at the London School of Economics. So the biography of John Stuart Mill is probably something that one should set in the context of someone who'd been trained as an economist, had a doctorate in economics and social psychology, and had probably, I think, earlier on a left-wing leaning in her economic assessment towards centrally planned economies, but presumably with Hayek moved much more towards a free market view of the world.
And of course, worth pointing out that Hayek himself was a refugee from Europe. So, you know, the plot thickens in a sense. No, she was clearly a complex, accomplished woman. And I think there's a danger. I mean, you know, she was a major collector, but I think it's also important to pay tribute to her as I say, a more fully rounded individual in her own right, for sure. I think maybe it's time to shift. Thank you very much, Philip, and also David, for your input there. Shall we shift the focus now, for the moment at least, to the whole internment experience? Perhaps I should just set the ball rolling before turning first to Yvonne and then involving David as well. To mention that actually she didn't go straight to the Isle of Man. This is something that's perhaps less well known than it should be, that actually most of the so-called enemy aliens, you know, arrested by the British government at a moment of national panic and paranoia in the early summer of 1940 for fear of a fifth column, etc., etc. I think Yvonne will say a little bit more about that. They didn't, most of them, go directly to the Isle of Man. There were many sort of transit camps on the mainland beforehand. The stories were often very checkered, to say the very least. And Dr. Rachel Pistol gave a very excellent talk just last week, which we will be putting on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel in due course, about some of those mainland transit camps, such as Worth Mills, which Richard Shaw, the maker of the film about Ruth Borchard, knows all about, because he in fact initiated a fabulous project investigating the very, very murky history of that former cotton mill near Manchester, which is one of the most, what shall I say, insalubrious, yeah, of all the transit camps. But in Ruth's case, there's another aspect to this, and that is that, like quite a few of the women internees, she first of all was interned, or perhaps one should indeed say imprisoned, in Holloway Prison, something that I think probably very few people know about. And moreover, the account that she wrote of her experiences is, I think I'm right in saying, one of the very few, correct me, Yvonne or David, if I'm wrong, one of the very few published accounts, or indeed records at all, of that particular episode. And there's an interesting story there, which some of you may perhaps know, that it's a kind of semi-fictionalized account. It's not actually an autobiography as such. The main character is called Anna Silva, but she's clearly modeled on Ruth herself. She wrote it in 1943, so just 3 years after the experience itself. And it remained unfinished. It's a very compelling read, but it stops at the moment she's actually transported, deported, whatever the word might be, to the Isle of Man. So it does dwell exclusively on her activities in Holloway Prison. And well, she left it unfinished, and it was only discovered among her belongings, I believe I'm right, after her death in 2000, and then only published in 2009. And Philip, you were saying, I think, that actually this has been a very useful resource for you in your revision of your own text. Yeah. So do look out. Yes, it's called We Are Strangers Here, which I think is a very poignant and telling title. We Are Strangers Here, and then subtitled An Enemy Alien in Prison in 1940. And there's a very excellent introduction by Dr. Charmian Brinson of Imperial College, who will actually be giving a talk, not about internment, but she knows a lot about that, but about the contribution of the former refugees, internees to the British war effort later in a month or two's time. So do look out for that. So yes, Yvonne, over to you perhaps now to kind of give us a sense of the wider context in which Ruth was experiencing internment.
I was going to say, starting actually with the start of the war in September 39, the refugees who had got to Britain in 1939 will have thought that they were safe, they had found their asylum. The fact that as soon as war is declared, they are immediately identified as enemy aliens, they have to register as such, and then are taken before tribunals, and these are done locally, within the local communities. And it's to identify if you're a security risk or not, which is how you end up with classifications of A, which means you're identified as an immediate security risk and imprisoned. Then you have Bs, which are possibly security risk, but it means that you can't live near the coast, you can't live near a military establishment. And then the vast majority of the people who have gone before a tribunal are classified as being category C, genuine refugees. So once you have got this classification, you think, again, you are safe, Britain is your asylum. But then the problem comes that by spring 1940, as you said, the rapid movement of the German invasion through Belgium, through the Netherlands, into France, there is this concern that there are fifth columnists, and the fifth columnists are amongst the refugees, that they are where all the spies are, and the fifth columnists, and that's why these countries have been falling so quickly. What's not realized until much later is actually the internal sort of, in a sense, fascist part of these countries' own population. But the view is that in the summer, say spring, summer 1940, it's not if there will be an invasion, it's when will there be an invasion. So the refugees who, as I say, have been identified as enemy aliens, they are seen as being a Trojan horse in Britain if there is an invasion. So come May 1940, the idea is they will have mass internment. The Isle of Man's been used as a site for internment in the First World War, and it therefore becomes a site for internment in the Second World War, again, as part of this mass internment policy, where, and it is debated, did Churchill say it, but there is the sort of collar the lot, and it doesn't matter whether you are a B or a C, you are seen as being a danger, and therefore you will be interned. In reality, what happens is, depending on how efficient your local police force are, is whether you get picked up or not. So Some people are never interned. Other people who are category C, genuine refugees, are interned. It's quite sort of arbitrary as to who is and who isn't interned. But there will be a knock at the door, there will be police officers, you're arrested, you're taken to one of the transit camps, and then you'll find yourself on the Isle of Man. And that could be for anything as short as 6 weeks to maybe up to 18 months or more. Once you've got to the Isle of Man, if you're one of the male internees, you'll be interned in groups of requisitioned hotels and boarding houses, which blocks of these hotels and boarding houses have barbed wire put around them. And the male internees are living in these hotels and boarding houses. And the military guard, the military authorities are looking after the external sort of perimeter security, but the internees basically look after themselves inside. They are provided with rations, but then they're in charge of the cooking, the cleaning, and actually, in a sense, sort of organizing themselves within the camp. Women and children, the women internees are quite different. They're actually billeted with local families in Port Erin and Port St Mary, where both of these sort of villages in the south of the island, the residents as well as the internees are all living behind the wire. So it's for the female internees and their children, it's a quite different experience. So the women and children are actually living with the Manx community behind the wire.
Can I just pick up on something that I think it was Ruth Hallgarten, who is Ruth Borchard's granddaughter, who was actually supposed to be joining us today. I should just add she's a GP and contacted me about an hour before the start time saying, I'm terribly sorry, but I simply can't join you. I also realized that I haven't introduced Yvonne properly, which I do apologize for, Yvonne. Yvonne Cresswell, who's until recently the curator of social history at Manx National Heritage, the Manx Museum in Douglas, who I can say hand on heart from first-hand experience, together with David, an absolute fount of information about internment in all its complicated and fascinating aspects. I'm very glad that we have both of you with us today. But one thing that Ruth said, clearly out of just simply not knowing the wider story, is that her understanding was that Catherine, her mother, was the only child, indeed she was a baby at the time, to be interned with her mother on the Isle of Man, and that is simply not the case. I'm right, actually? Yeah.
That, I was interested in that as well, because actually it wasn't sort of the majority, but there were a significant number of mothers with children, and that went from the very first batch of internees who arrived, of female internees who arrived in late May, brought children with them. Because the first groups of internees was sort of Port Erin and Port St Mary, it might be that Ruth was actually in part of the camp where there weren't any other children, and therefore within the sort of surrounding hotels and boarding houses, that actually, you know, her child was the only one that was there. So in a sense, I was intrigued about that, because there were children, and the number of children did actually grow in the first few months of internment, because I've met a lot of people who were interned as children, and they said themselves about the fact that that first summer, the summer of 1940, it was beautiful weather, and they went swimming and they played on the beach. A lot of them do joke, as was mentioned in the Imperial War Museum interviews with ex-internees, that the children in the Russian camp did basically go feral that summer and thoroughly enjoyed themselves. So, as I say, that there was actually sort of a growing number of children amongst the internees. I was going to mention the fact that because summer was so good and people were going swimming and were on the beach and sunbathing or whatever, it did mean that the British press that summer who were particularly antagonistic against enemy aliens were actually able to use this as part of a campaign about sort of all of these enemy aliens who were enjoying sort of the holiday isle at the taxpayers' expense. So it did actually feed into a lot of negative propaganda at the time. But equally well, in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, there were major debates going on about sort of, you know, should we have interned these people? Why have we interned them? People like the Bishop of Chichester, Bishop Bell, was campaigning to stop internment and for a mass internment policy that had started so quickly as a knee-jerk reaction. There's a lot of debate through the summer as to whether this policy should be continued. And it's interesting as to whether it was the moral arguments that won out or whether it was the fact that, you know, companies like ICI were basically headhunting top, you know, sort of chemists, industrial chemists who'd been interned and actually saying, well, we want this person, this person, and this person out immediately because we want them for the war effort. And, you know, you could sort of say that there are obviously people in Whitehall who are suddenly panicking, thinking, actually, who do we have interned? At which point, by the autumn of 1940, they're actually organising what amount to occupation censuses in the camps to find out who they've got interned. And because they suddenly realised we have some really important people with amazing skills that we need for the British war effort. So it's this odd thing that internment starts in the end of May 1940. People are being sort of, in a sense, headhunted and released starting in about August onwards, and then growing numbers are released because actually they suddenly realise that they have interned what internees called themselves His Majesty's most loyal enemy aliens, and they were desperate to be released and to work for the British war effort.
And indeed, another way out, as it were, was the Pioneer Corps, wasn't it? Which
Yes.
was a path that many of the men took. I think perhaps also to the name George Bell, who's obviously an important figure, one should also add Eleanor Rathbone, the MP for refugees, I think she was called by some, and also the Quakers, who played, you know, a really, I think to this day, the unsung heroes of this, much of, you know, this story. David, I'm thinking with your business background and your mention of the service exchange, would you like to chip in at this point and say something about what Ruth actually got up to, how, you know, what she implemented in Russian camp?
Yes, happy to do that. But before I do, perhaps I could clarify a little bit this issue of children in the Russian internment camp. Unfortunately, the figures are a little elastic, but the general feeling or the general sense is that there were at least 300 children in the camp. Added to that, there is the commandant talked about 300 pregnant women arriving in the initial intake in the camp. So obviously those women gave birth in the camp, or at least in the camp or in one of the hospitals. And so the idea that there was somebody who didn't know that there were children in the camp, I would find a little bit surprising. I think there were children, there were schools, Minnespecht was setting up schools. So there was a lot going on in that camp in terms of children and a recognition of the need for education. And you're right, Yvonne, I mean, the summer was was a very good summer, unusual perhaps for the Isle of Man. And so people were able to enjoy it. And everybody talks about it, whether they were in the women's camp or in the men's camp, that how good that summer was. But coming on to the service exchange, this was, it was recognized that one of the biggest problems was boredom. And therefore, and the men's camps, there was all kinds of things happening in the men's camps. And obviously Hutchinson Square is well recorded in terms of what was going on there. But there was also this issue in the women's camp, and of course there was only one women's camp, as to how these women were to be kept occupied. And when you've got over 3,000 women and kids, it becomes an issue. And it was actually, I think, a combination of Ruth Borchard and Margaret Collier, who was one of the Quakers in the camp, who convinced the commandant, Dame Joanna Cruikshank, that there was a sensible direction to take in terms of what can almost be called occupational therapy. And this was introduced in, I think, September, October. And the idea was that instead of the women just sort of occupying themselves, that they would create an internal market. And a lot of the women had skills. They might have skills as seamstresses, or they might have other skills in terms of ability to cook and so on and so forth, and to make things. So they designed, with the help of the commandant, who provided the equipment, sewing machines and so forth, a situation where the skills of these women were harnessed in a segmented manner, and they started a market whereby goods could be exchanged for tokens. The tokens were they were not allowed to have money in the camp, and the tokens were made from old cartons, cereal cartons and so forth, that they cut up, and they ultimately established a value associated with these tokens of about threepence each, I believe. This was written up subsequently by Ruth, and the service exchange apparently involved about a third of the women in the camp. It was limited only by presumably the number of coupons that they could make and the equipment, because there was a shortage of equipment, so there was a limitation on the amount of the work that the women were allowed to do. They were allowed a maximum of 6 half days a week. So that was a full week's work in Russian internment camp consisted of 6 half days. And the camp, the service exchange lasted well over a year, about 15 or 16 months, and only broke down as internees were being released, which was really sort of starting late 1941 into 42 from the women's camp. So that sort of is a brief picture. Ruth wrote it up both in an article in the Manchester Guardian in 1942, and also she wrote an essay which won a prize for an economic essay from the Quakers.
Interesting. Philip, would you like to chip in there? You know, have your own researches revealed more detail about Ruth's experiences on the Isle of Man?
There's a rather nice quote from her daughter Catherine made in recent years. She said, "My mother said the worst thing was not knowing when we would be released, and the best thing was the friendships forged with both fellow internees and locals. In London, it was the Blitz, and they were sharing half a bedroom with family. Here it was tranquil and the hottest summer on record. We just played on the beach." That gives a flavour of what you've evoked, you know, the other speakers have evoked. But I think when they were, one second, they were released, it wasn't until September 1941 that Ruth and Kurt were released from internment, and then her new life began, you know, with all kinds of new possibilities.
Were they released at the same time? Because that would be quite unusual. Am I right? Or maybe not? Given that they were, you know, imprisoned, they were interned in different camps, obviously.
Yes, indeed. That's the information that I have, that they were released in the same month, in September 1941. So that was a long period being imprisoned and interned.
Was that usual that a husband and wife, who presumably were indeed not in the married camp but in the two separate camps, be released at the same time? Were the authorities that considerate?
I was actually thinking it might have been because they weren't going to be transferred to the married camp, that's why they were released together. But that was just a supposition.
Okay, now time is rushing on. This is all fascinating and hopefully, informative to the audience. I'm just thinking maybe before opening it up to questions and, people's own stories, perhaps, David, whether you'd like to say something about the Russian Heritage Trust and when it was set up, why it was set up, what you're up to, what you have done, what you hope to achieve to sort of bring things very much, into the present.
Certainly. Well, the Russian Heritage Trust was set up in 2014 as an initiative to increase the understanding of the southern part of the island. I should emphasize, by the way, when we use this word Russian, it's nothing to do with Bolsheviks or the Russian Revolution. It's Rushen, which is one of the 6 former administrative areas of the Isle of Man, and covered the south of the island, including the coastal villages of Port Erin and Port St. Mary, which was the location of the internment camp. The trust was set up in 2014, as I said. It's all volunteer people, and I happened to be living in the south of the island at the time. That's when I got involved, when I heard that there was a program to research the internment in the south of the island, which was relatively understudied at that stage. There were other initiatives going with regard to the farming, tourism, the various things that took place historically in the south of the island, and it remains very active. I can speak specifically, really only about the internment group. There are a group of I think 6 of us who've been working to try to better understand and document the internment in the south of the camp for over the last 6 years. Which started off with a couple of exhibitions in the St. Catherine's Church, which historically is interesting because that was where the women internees were processed as they were brought to the south of the island, mostly by train into the station in Port Erin, and then marched or walked across to the St. Catherine's Church. And then in 2019, I think it was 18 or 19, we actually published a number of essays on various aspects of the camp in a publication entitled Friend or Foe. And for those of you who are more interested in getting into depth on it, I can thoroughly recommend it. I was one of the authors, of course, so I have to recommend it. But it is a compendium of life in the women's internment camp, which touches on many aspects. And Ruth Borchard is profiled in one of those chapters.
Lovely, thank you. Shall we perhaps just round off this sort of semi-formal part of the evening with Philip perhaps asking you to say something about Ruth's legacy in terms of the art world, because it's very much present, isn't it? Would you like to just say something about that?
Yes, and she collected an immense range of works from very diverse kinds of artists. I mean, there were the pupils of David Bomberg, such as Dennis Creffield and Dorothy Mead, who attended, the Polytechnic classes in the late 40s. So there was this very strong expressionist element to a lot of the work. There were artists of more academic representational kinds, like Michael Knox, for example. She collected works by virtually unknown artists. She didn't set out to buy works by people who were already established necessarily, and she tended to avoid all reviews. So just to make up, she wanted to make up her own mind about all the pictures. So she collected works by artists who, when Face to Face was published in 2004, artists who were completely unknown, and the critics often singled out their works as being gems of the collection, such as Brian Rees, who created an angry young man-like self-portrait, which has affinities with contemporaneous art by Lucian Freud and John Craxton. And he came from a Welsh mining background and had few opportunities in life, and worked for publishing houses in London, designing book jackets, including one of the earliest book jackets for Under Milk Wood, which was very suitable given his background. And there's a small picture by a completely unknown artist, probably a student, called John White, one of the very few artists in the collections, almost unique now, whom we know absolutely nothing about. And his small, intense self-portrait has a real expressionist magic. Then there are very well-known artists today, like Anne Redpath and Horace Brodsky, and many others, Cecil Collins, Patrick Heyman. So Ruth wasn't seeking for any particular style in art, but she was just alert to very real voices, I would say.
How close a personal relationship did she form with the artists she commissioned and had dealings with? Were there some to whom she became particularly close?
Yes, some she became very good friends with. Geoffrey White and Michael Noakes were near neighbours in Reigate, so they would attend her salon evenings. She developed, well, a correspondence with several of the artists, especially, as I mentioned, Eiffel Colquhoun, and they discussed sexism in Kabbalah circles, which Eiffel was very concerned about, that the women, that their ideas on religion and mysticism tended to be completely dismissed. And they had a very illuminating correspondence. Ruth tended to meet these artists and collect their self-portraits in London hotels. So there's wonderful kind of period notes to the correspondence. So we will meet at 3 o'clock in the foyer of this hotel near Victoria, and they would often have tea together, or in a railway station hotel. So it's very evocative of that period, I think.
Am I right in, I think I read somewhere, indeed maybe it's mentioned in the film, that she made notes about her collecting activities in a pre-war German diary that she had presumably brought with her from Germany?
The little black book referred to and shown in the film is a pre-1938 German diary, and she turned it upside down, which may have been symbolic in some way, and rubbed out the dates or crossed them out. And she just mentioned the myriad of artists that she was interested in. You know, she did approach people like Francis Bacon, Lucian Freud, Henry Moore, and many lesser known artists. And in fact, 100 artists responded very positively. And she aimed at, I think she did aim at 100 self-portraits, and then she stopped. And so the self-portraits range from 1957 to 1972. And only 5% of the artists are women artists. But they have a very strong gravity in the collection. And I think their works are very considerable in meaning and import. So it's almost as though 20% of them were by women artists in a sense.
I couldn't help picking up on what Robert Travers, who sadly again couldn't join us today, but as you may already know, it's Piano Nobile, which is Robert Travers' gallery here in London, which has acted for many years as the custodian of the Ruth Borchard Collection. But in the film, as you may yourselves have noticed, when quizzed about the sort of relative lack of women artists in the collection, he sort of slightly evaded the issue, it seems to me, by saying, well, there weren't that many women artists working, which is surely not the case. Anyway, I think that's a question perhaps for another day. But yeah, you're right. The ones in the collection are powerful, aren't they?
There's a fair number of women artists, but most of them declined. Why, I don't know.
That's interesting. I wonder why. And can you just tell us also, by way of conclusion, about the Self-Portrait Prize and the whole Next Generations project, which is, I think, entirely relevant here?
Yes, that was set up in, following the emergence of the collection. So over the last number of years, there has been a prize every second year with a competition and an exhibition of self-portraits by contemporary artists. So it's open to universal submission. And the exhibitions tended to be, until recently, at King's Place, the King's Place Gallery near King's Cross. And I think the works show a continuation of Ruth's spirit, in a sense, because the works selected often have this strong emotive and symbolic power, which is often lacking in contemporary art. And the flavor of her kind of expressionistic vision, I think, is pursued in this collection, in this new collection.
It's a wonderful example. I think it comes across very nicely in the film itself, you know, that sort of sense of continuity and a kind of lasting legacy. That's absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm just looking at the time. It's now 6:50. The evening is drawing on, as they say. Perhaps I should round things off before asking people to contribute in whatever way they would like. Just in saying that both David and Yvonne have been wonderfully helpful in the plans, which have been slightly thwarted or at least postponed because of COVID, alas, to install a blue AJR, Association of Jewish Refugees plaque in the ferry terminal of Douglas, the capital, as you probably know, of the Isle of Man, to commemorate the mostly Jewish, not always, but mostly Jewish internees from this period. We're talking about 1940-41, and indeed the way that they were received, often in most cases benignly, by those who, you know, who played host to them on the Isle of Man and who interacted with them. There was to be a trip, some of you already know this, for mid-October, which would have coincided with the installation of the plaque. For purely practical reasons to do with COVID, we've decided, reluctantly, I have to say, to postpone it to late March. And if anybody is interested, if you look, it's mentioned on the Insiders Outsiders website, but particularly if you look at Jewish Renaissance magazine website and type in enemy aliens on the Isle of Man, you will be able to access full details about that. So I think one or two of you in the audience already signed up, but you might like to find out more for those of you who perhaps don't yet know about it. So these are, you know, there's an ongoing interest. Am I right, Yvonne and David? I know, Yvonne, you are constantly, yes, I think I'm right, getting inquiries, mostly, I assume, by email these days from people who are researching their family history. And David too. I mean, it's interesting to me that the Heritage Trust was only set up in 2014, such a very long time after the whole internment episode. I mean, would you agree with me that there seems to be a kind of groundswell, perhaps ever increasing, on the part of second and maybe third generation, you know, descendants of the people who went through it at first hand?
I would definitely say that, because I started working on what was the Living with the Wire exhibition in 1989. It was meant to have been in the exhibition in 1990, but because there was so much material, we didn't have the exhibition and the accompanying catalogue until 1994. And at the time, I sort of thought, oh, there's so much interest, but once we've had the exhibition, that will then trail off. And it never did. It actually just kept growing year on year. And I find it fascinating that back in '94, when we did Living with the Wire, in the introduction to the catalogue, I sort of say about, you know, this fear of internment being almost a lost footnote in 20th century British history. And I would say that since then, with the growth of academic interest, of the families of ex-internees, and as you say, the sort of the second and third generations, but just growing interest in the sort of whole issue of civilian internments, and it is just building year on year. Whereas in the late 1980s, you know, there wasn't that much information and material available. People had researched government policy. People might be interested in the interned artists, in particular Kurt Schwitter's. But since then, it's the whole issue of internment and all the different aspects of it. And because new information is becoming available all the time, it's an ever expanding field. So it's never a point where you can sort of say, well, that's it. Everything that could have been discovered has been discovered. And every time, I must admit personally, I answer one question, that question raises 5, 10 or more further questions. So the more research that's done, the more questions keep arising. And what fascinates me is there isn't a single internee experience. For every internee, it was their personal experience. And it's just the variety of different experiences from people who actually, it said later, it was the best of times. They made lifelong friends. They were able to work as artists, to other people for whom their experiences were horrific. And then the vast majority for whom it was, as Dickens says, the best of times and the worst of times. And it is that wealth of a variety of personal experience. And it's about recording and capturing that and being able to pass that on.
You've played a very major part in that. David, would you like to add anything on that?
Well, I would endorse everything that Yvonne has said. I mean, we've found through the internment team at the Russian Heritage Trust that people have contacted us from around the world to find out information, and typically there's been a connection of some kind, a family connection relating to that. I mean, we were very fortunate with the exhibitions, which were well attended. I mean, these were church hall exhibitions in essence, as Yvonne well knows, but we got about 2,500 people to each of those exhibitions, which is a remarkably large number. And that wasn't all visitors, that was mostly people from the Isle of Man. So there's an increasing interest, I think, in the Isle of Man, or amongst the Isle of Man population, in what happened at that time. And I've noticed, I think, a change of attitude. I moved here in 2007, and at that time I sensed a little bit of a resistance to sort of digging into the internment era, but I think that's changing now. I think we're seeing a desire to know more and to understand more. We were fortunate, very fortunate, in the first exhibition that Ruth Borchard's daughter, Catherine Helgarten, came to open it. So she says that she doesn't have a memory of being in the camp, but of course, to have somebody who actually was in the camp to come and open the exhibition had a tremendous impact for people. So yes, I would endorse what Yvonne has said, and I hope that we're able to go on sort of uncovering the layers of information and learning more and more about about the period, because it's a fascinating period. It's particularly fascinating, obviously, for people who have family connections, but it's fascinating also, I think, for people who have not studied this, what Yvonne called a footnote in 20th century history, and for people in the Isle of Man, because from a cultural and sociological standpoint, it was a period in Isle of Man history which was very different.
Yeah, no, indeed. Indeed. I have a question from Michael Marks, a very practical one, which I'm sure you can answer. Is there a list of names of those who were interned? What are the records like?
Right. Unfortunately, every internee originally had an alien registration card with their photograph on. The cards for the men were destroyed. But, and one of these sort of things where, you know, sort of it's quite arbitrary what records are kept, what records are destroyed. The women's cards were kept. So when people have contacted Manx National Heritage about an individual internee, it's, you know, more chances than not, actually, if it's a female internee, there will be a registration card that can be accessed. There was also, since we did Living with the Wire in 1994, there was a sort of building up and development of a database. So using a variety of different sources, such as camp newspapers, and let's say the Imperial War Museum interviews, and all sorts of different sort of primary and secondary sources, a database of the male internees has also been built up, but it's a lot more hit and miss, whether somebody contacted the museum to see if there's any information about a particular male internee. There might be information, there might not be. But for the female internees, there is usually an internment card.
It's tempting to surmise that maybe those records, or some of them at least, were destroyed accidentally on purpose, or perhaps even on purpose. I mean, is there any evidence to support that?
No, I think it's just one of these arbitrary things. Somebody was sort of clearing out, and whereas the female cards, I think it might be, and this is from memory, maybe 6,000-7,000 female cards. There were several thousand for the men. So the men's cards would have just taken up more space. and that's when you sort of think it's on such minor things as that. And actually, the island had been used for internment in the First World War. And there was a similar issue for internment in the First World War, that a lot of the records were destroyed. And I've also interestingly heard people comment that records were destroyed because the internees were not criminals. They hadn't committed a crime. And I did hear someone once say about the idea that maybe records from the First World War and then maybe the Second World War were destroyed because it was felt to not be ethically correct to be keeping records on people who have committed crimes.
I guess that's what I was wondering about. Yes.
Yeah. Also, as I say, things can still appear, because a few years ago, the museum received a phone call from somebody in the south of England to say, I've just seen in what amounted to a junk shop, a book that is basically the nominal roll for one of the internment camps. And it was a complete listing, a census for, I think it was one of the Italian internee camps. And that was just picked up about 10 or more years ago in the equivalent of a junk shop on the south coast. So it is interesting that there are what amount to, or what were the sort of daily records from camps, which were frequently destroyed when the camp closed, but some of them actually just appear to have survived and then turn up in the oddest of places.
Richard Borchard, I wonder if I could put you on the spot slightly, or at least invite you. I think some of you may have noticed that we have Richard Borchard, who is one of Ruth's children, clearly her son, in the audience, who I know didn't want to be involved formally. But Richard, if you would like to say something, we'd be ever so appreciative, but equally if you don't, that's absolutely fine. And if anybody else has any questions or comments, please, now is the moment. It's now 7 o'clock. Please unmute yourselves if you would like. But Richard, in the first instance, would you like to just say something?
I can talk a bit about the collection and the way it's developed since my mother asked me, I think it was about 97, because the pictures were stacked up in a flat in Hampstead, and she said, "Why don't you do something with these?" And so so it started. I met Robert Travers just by accident. I was in his gallery buying a small sculpture, and I told him about the collection. He was excited. And he came up to Hampstead to see it and got more excited, and we decided together, and we managed to pay the bills, and he did the work, and he's looked after it. It's more than 20 years now. His first great success really was in the year 2000 in the Commonwealth Institute in High Street, Kensington. There was the 21st Century British Art Fair, and he persuaded them to put all 100 pictures, self-portraits, at the entrance to the exhibition. And there must have been about 30,000 people saw the collection in 4 or 5 days. And that was the beginning of the connection with King's Place, because they wanted to buy the collection to be part of the development, and we didn't want to. And we said, "Oh, we'll do something together. We'll have a space there." And that's when the idea of having a competition started. And so the whole thing which we've done as a family is really as a memorial for our mum, that she did many things, and when anything that was really interesting in her life, she'd write a book about it. Whether it was the first one about having her first baby, or about Mill, who she was excited about, from the political side, in what he was doing then, or whether it was roses or anything else. If it was interesting, she'd write a book and then move on to the next idea. And it's the same with the self-portraits. By the time she got to the 100, then that was the end of the idea.
And yet her legacy lives on so very effectively. And I'm right in saying also, Richard, that I think works from the core collection regularly, indeed every year, travel to a different venue. And I think this year it's been Coventry, the capital of, the sort of city of culture.
We had the prize this year because the King's Place was sold, and so the relationship between Robert and King's Place came to an end.
Oh, I didn't realize that, in fact, but yes, okay.
And so they and Coventry Cathedral let us be there as a city of culture this year. We had the prize giving there, and it was a good party with all the people, and Charles and Camilla came to inspect it, and so it's all becoming very much part of the establishment now, which is good. We had what, 2,300 and something entries this year for the competition.
Wonderful, wonderful. I wonder if I could conclude just by asking a question which you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I'm curious always when, I speak for my own parents, to what extent your mother was willing or chose to speak about her pre-war life in Germany. How much did you growing up know?
Of course we knew all the stories. That was The Children of the Old House. That's a collection of the stories about her childhood.
Oh, but that's the happy childhood, isn't it? And that's what is obviously important to remember too.
But of the more and very unpleasant parts of it, they kept very quiet.
Yeah.
And didn't want to. I know a bit about it, but I know how unpleasant it was and how difficult. My father being taken in by the Gestapo, and it was a hard time.
Indeed, and I'm sure that will ring a bell with many of us in the audience.
Everybody who survived has a story.
For sure. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm so glad you could join us. As I say, I'm astonished that there aren't more questions coming in, but if anybody wants to find out more, whether it's their own family involved or not in the stories, then do write to the Insiders Outsiders Gmail address that's on the website, and then I could always forward your emails to, I think, probably Yvonne in the first instance. And also, just by way of final conclusion, to mention that this evening, and I must stop now to give everybody a breather, as some of you may indeed already know, there's an event which is very much a kind of logical sequel in a way to this one that started at 6 at 8 o'clock with Sonia Lambert, the writer and teacher, who has actually written her own novel based or inspired in large measure by the accounts of those who went through it at first hand, among them, of course, Ruth Borchard's own account that we've talked about, We Are Strangers Here. So if you're interested and haven't yet signed up and have the energy to carry on tonight, it starts at 8 p.m. And also there's a whole, I think, rich, though I say it myself, a rich program ongoing through October, which you can find on the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website. If you look in the What's On section, and even better, sign up to the newsletter, you'll be kept informed about what's in store. We mentioned, for example, the Hutchinson camp, the so-called artist camp, which some of you will know about. One of the participants in an event on the 7th of October is Simon Parkin, a very engaging journalist and writer who is about to publish a book called The Island of Extraordinary Captives. It's a great name, I think you'll agree, but which does focus particularly on Hutchinson camp. And he's going to be in conversation with the daughter, Jackie Richardson, the daughter of Klaus Hinrichsen, who again, as some of you may know, was a German-born art historian who became the kind of unofficial chronicler of the very rich cultural life of Hutchinson. So that's one to look out for. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. That was a fascinating event. And of course, my heartfelt thanks go to our speakers, to David Wertheim, to Yvonne Cresswell, to Philip, and of course also to Richard Borchard for joining us. And I hope to see some of you at further events. Okay, all the best everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.